Mahalo. So aloha mai kako. My name is Lisa Leilani Ka'anoi from the Health Workforce Development Center called Maliola Lama Lama at Papa'olalokahi, the Native Hawaiian Board of Health. Mahalo for joining us, and mahalo for those who will be joining us via the recording. So just as I mentioned, this is being recorded. In the future, if there's a webinar you'd like to see but aren't able to, as long as you register, you will receive the recording. For questions or comments, you may use the Q&A feature or the chat located in the Zoom toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if this is the first time you're joining us, you will be automatically added to our email list for future presentations. And last, at the end, there will be a pop-up with the survey. Please share your mana'o with us. This is how we get ideas for future topics for our webinars. If you have to run to another meeting or you don't have time to fill out the survey, that's okay. We'll resend it on Monday. So we'll go ahead and get started. I will introduce Ginny Wright, who is our speaker today. And Ginny Wright and her husband, Gene, have been married for 46 years and have 7 children ranging in age from 8 to 34 years old. All of their children are adopted, and 6 of the children have special needs. Their challenges include attention deficit disorder, autism spectrum disorder, complex and fragile medical conditions, fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and cognitive disabilities. They have also been foster parents to more than 24 children, most with disabilities. Raised in Kailua, Ginny graduated from Weber State University in Ogden, Utah, with a BA in early childhood education and taught in Utah for several years before returning home to Hawaii. Upon returning, she switched careers and established an association management firm and currently manages 3 nonprofit trade associations in Hawaii. Before her youngest child's medical condition, it made travel challenging. She had traveled extensively throughout the world and has visited every continent except Antarctica. Nowadays, she enjoys painting, hiking, and family history research. Her top 2 favorite desserts are strawberry, is it shortcake or cheesecake? One of those 2, and also chocolate dipped strawberries. And I believe she has also won the award for
Miss America.
Miss America. Miss America, and I believe you were the parent of the year in like 2011?
Yes.
All right, well, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you for that introduction. And also, I think I'm saying thank you for providing this opportunity for me. I've spoken in front of all kinds of groups. I've done a lot of webinars on different topics, but somehow I found this one especially challenging, to tell you the truth, as it caused me to really reflect on my family and some of the things that we've experienced in our life. I want to say, first of all, and also thanks to Lisa. Lisa's going to operate my slide deck for me because I'm not really good at doing 2 things at once. So for the first slide, Lisa. So the title of my presentation is Always Room for One More. And I'm going to tell you a little bit why I selected that as my title in a little bit. But first, I wanted to, at the very beginning, let you know that I identify with both an ethnic and a religious culture, both with an ethnic and religious cultures. And I think as I go through my presentation today, you'll see the perspective from both of them. And I sincerely hope that when I convey those messages and those values of those cultures, that I don't offend anyone in the process. Next slide, Lisa. As I was preparing for this, I thought about my favorite quote by a man named Rex E. Lee, and it is, "We have all drunk from wells we did not dig. and warmed ourselves by fires we did not build. And as I looked at my role as a mother, as I looked at the opportunities I've had as a parent, as a daughter, as a family member, I have been so grateful for those that dug those wells from which I drank, and for those who built those fires where I warmed myself. And it's my hope that I build wells and I build fires for others in the future. You know, about 5 years ago, I faced kind of a dilemma, and I was trying to figure out what to give my children for Christmas. And I was especially thinking of my children that are, I call the ones that are grown and flown, those that no longer live at home. And one day when I was contemplating that, I remembered an incident with my oldest daughter, Susan, when she went away to college. The night before her flight, she said to me, "Oh, Mom, we've got to go to the store because I have to get a kennel." And I said, "Well, what do you need a kennel for?" And she said, "Well, for Elvis." And Elvis was her dog. And I said, "You can't take Elvis with you to college." And she said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Because dogs aren't allowed in your dorm." And she looked at me and she said, "Well, if I had known that, I would never have applied to that college." Fast forward a couple of months, she was at college without her dog, living in the dorm, and we would talk to her on Sunday afternoons. And so one Sunday afternoon, called her, said, "Well, how's it going? How's your day?" And she goes, "Oh, it's pretty good, but I was late to church today." And I said, "Oh, you slept in?" And she said, "Mom, have you ever heard of this thing called daylight savings time?" And I said, "Yeah, I've heard of it." And she said, "Isn't that the stupidest thing you've ever heard of? People think they can change the clock and it changes time." And I said, "Well, you'd better change your clock." And she said, "I'm not going to do it. I think it's wrong. I'm just not going to do it." When I visited her several weeks later, she still hadn't changed her clock. And her roommates were saying, "Make her change her clock. She's late to everything." So while I was contemplating what I was going to give my children for Christmas, I remembered those two stories. And I thought, you know, you send your kids away and you hope you've taught them everything they need to know. And about a dog at college and daylight savings time, well, I totally messed up on those. But in the grand scheme of things, how important is that? I have a firm belief that whether in this life or the next life, we're going to be held accountable for what we teach our children and what we don't teach them, and what kind of example we are to them and what kind of example we're not to them. So as I thought about this gift for my children, I decided, well, you know, I better get all my bases covered. I thought I taught my children the things they needed to know, but let's make sure. And so I decided that for Christmas, I was going to write a book. And the book I ended up writing was called Lessons I Hope I've Taught, Musings from Mom. And it was a bestseller. It sold out because we only published enough books for my children, for me to give my children. And I'd really recommend anybody who's a parent, especially, to do something like this, because it really makes you think and evaluate not only what are the values that you hold, but what are those values that you hope you've taught your children. So in writing this book, I thought, okay, if I really didn't teach it, now it's in writing, they can read it, and now my conscience is clear. What they do with it after that is up to them. So I divided the book into different chapters or lessons. Next slide, Lisa. And so there were 10 chapters or lessons. And so here's the countdown. Chapter 10, lesson 10 was "These things are true." And in that chapter, I covered some of the religious beliefs that I hold true. Number 9 was "Everything we go through prepares us for something to come." Number 8, "Your father is really the best." Number 7, "What I like most about you is that you are kind." 6, "Did you think to pray?" 5, "If you feel inclined and are able to lend, don't, just give." 4, "Potluck is not always best." 3, you determine your destiny. 2, if you're sad, serve. And the number one lesson that I hope I taught my children, and I hope I continue to instill in them, is there's always room for one more. So when Lisa asked me to come up with a title, it was very easy for me to come up with always room for one more. So with that, I want to introduce you to my family. Next slide. So as Lisa mentioned in my introduction, my husband and I have been married for 46 years. And this is my husband. His name is Ginny. And I put these two pictures up mainly to show you the picture on the one side, the black and white, was our engagement picture. And look how gorgeous I am in that picture. And the other picture, the color picture, was taken this past October. And look, not only am I gorgeous, I'm even more gorgeous than I was 46 years ago. And I know that's because of my Hawaiian genes. I'm very, very proud of that. My husband and I met more than 50 years ago, actually. And one of the things that people always say to me is, well, what is your secret to being married that long? And I always say the same answer, and that is selection. One of the things that I appreciated about my husband is that he and I came from very similar kinds of homes. And in those homes, there was always room for one more. We both lived in homes where we had brothers and sisters, we had parents, aunts and uncles, cousins, friends, others who came and went as the need arose, and either lived with us for a short period of time or long periods of time, or came and celebrated holidays with us, or were there for dinner on Sunday, those kinds of things. And so both of us came from that kind of background. And when we got married, it was very easy for us to agree that we wanted to have that kind of home as we began our life together. I think the other thing that helped us to stay married this long is that both of us approach problems and challenges in a very similar manner. And let's go to the next slide. And we both have kind of this philosophy about challenges and problems. First, our challenges can be blessings. Second, our challenges can prepare us, teach us, and change us. And third, our challenges can become opportunities for us to serve. And this kind of perspective, I think, has been really helpful for us as we've raised our family, especially a family of so many children and a family that's a little complex. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to the children in our family. Next slide. This is our daughter, Susan, and we adopted Susan after we'd been married for 12 years. And we adopted her through our church adoption agency. And this was in 1988. And we got her as a newborn, and she was the most beautiful little baby you could ever meet. I know all parents say that, but guarantee she was just the most adorable little girl. And as she's grown, she's always been just the most delightful child. As she's grown, people have always told her, oh, you really pulled the haole like your father. And we go, yeah, she does. Although there's no blood relations, there certainly is a heart relationship with her. And today, I wanted to tell you, as she was growing up, she never caused any problems. She was a really good girl. She was a good student. Now she's in her 30s. She is single, although there's a picture up there of her with her boyfriend, and he's a really good boyfriend. So maybe she's not going to be single for too long. Not sure about that. But she really is a wonderful person. She's worked for the Department of Education for a number of years, specifically with children with disabilities, and she's very, very good at what she does. If you were to ask her brothers and sisters, who's your favorite sibling in the family? I think all of them would say Susan. Now, my children that are home now all have some kind of disability, and they view Susan in two ways. For example, Susan is going to come on and spend the night tonight, and all of the kids are so excited that Susan is coming over. because they know it'll be fun and that she'll pay attention to them and that she really, really loves them. The other side of Susan is that when my children do something wrong, they'll usually say, "Don't tell Susan." Not because she's mean, but because Susan has high expectations of her siblings. And she's such she encourages them so much to be the best that they can be. And I think sometimes they just don't want to disappoint her. Susan is really one of my heroes in my life, because as we've added to our family, she certainly has had to take on that role of big sister, and she's embraced that challenge and made room in her life for each one of her siblings. Our next child, next slide, is Jacob, and he has the name of Jacob Kaimipono, and we adopted him again through our church agency in 1990, and he was a newborn. And as a little kid, Jacob was the most active kid I ever knew. As he grew, he continued to be active, but he was kind of odd. I call him a little odd. And to this day, he's a wonderful person, just kind of quirky. He's got certain quirks. When he started school, he started having some behavior issues at school. And finally, he received a diagnosis of autism. And I remember when he got the diagnosis, when we were at the doctor's and he got the diagnosis, it was a Friday. And the next morning was Saturday. I was up very early in my kitchen. I was preparing a meal for a youth group from our church. And it was dark outside. I was by myself and I was in this kitchen and I was crying and I was praying and I was saying, "Heavenly Father, help me, please. I don't know what to do about this boy," because I knew very little about autism and I just didn't know what to do. And as I was crying there, and I almost felt arms wrap around me, and I heard this voice say to me, "Remember, he was my child before he was your child, and I will not let you fail him." With that confirmation that he was so special and he was so loved, I jumped into the challenge of learning more about autism. And I got in contact with everybody I could identify as an expert in autism. I identified with other families who had children with autism. I connected every which way I could to learn as much as I could to help my boy. The challenge of that autism diagnosis changed me. And I became a very, very strong advocate for all children with disabilities and especially children with autism. I also found as I went along that I learned a lot and that I started viewing myself as an expert, not in all autism, but I was an expert on autism in my boy. Yep, that diagnosis changed me. Today, Jacob is in his 30s. He graduated from high school. He attended a special school for about 7 years, but then graduated from a public high school, went on a 2-year mission for our church, has lived in Utah for 10 years, and last October got married, and that's a picture up in the corner, to a beautiful, beautiful girl named Daisy, and we're so happy to count her as in our family. So that's Jacob. Next slide. A couple of years later, we went back to our church agency because we wanted to adopt again, and they said, "Well, we'd like you to work with this intern here in our office." And this intern happened to work for Department of Human Services in Child Welfare. And she said, "You know, there's a 3-month-old little baby in a home, in a foster home, and we're trying to find an adoptive home for him. Would you be interested in taking him?" And we said, "Sure." And back then there wasn't really any transition. It's like she told us about it, and 2 weeks later she brought him over to our house. And this little 3-month-old little boy we named Gabriel Iosepa, or Gabe. And when he came to us, we saw that he had a number of issues, and we learned that he had been drug exposed in utero, and he had some of the after effects of that. And as the years went by, some of those issues resolved themselves. However, we noticed when he was very young that he had a special talent. He was a people magnet. Wherever he went, he attracted people. He attracted other kids. If we went to the store, if we're standing in a line, anywhere, he always had the most friends, and he made friends very, very quickly. Now, this was a challenge for me as a mother when he was in high school, because I would often wake up in the morning and go to his room to wake him up, and there'd be some other kid staying overnight. And sometimes they would stay over just one night, and sometimes they'd stay for the weekend, and sometimes they'd stay for every weekend for years, and sometimes they'd come and they'd stay for long, long periods of time. And as I was thinking about that and those experiences that we had with Gabe, I remembered all of those people that he had brought into our house, that he had found room for in his room in his life. And every single one of them came from a background or circumstances where they needed some kind of extra help. Gabe has always been one of my heroes because he's had that special gift of being able to make room in his life and in his everyday life, and also in his home for those who might be less fortunate. Gabe now lives in Utah and has lived there for a number of years and just had an industrial accident, so I hope he gets better really soon. Next slide. Several years after Gabe came into our lives, we got a call from a social worker that we didn't know. And it was 9 o'clock at night. And I answered the phone, and this woman said, well, you don't know me, but I'm a social worker with Department of Human Services. And I found your family's file, and I see that you've had some good experiences with kids that had some problems. And I have a little 3.5-year-old girl on my caseload. She's been in foster care her entire life. She's a little delayed, but we need to find an adoptive family for her. Would you be willing to take her? And we said, well, let's meet her. I think so. Let's meet her. And so we met this tiny little 3.5-year-old girl at the park. At 3.5, she was just learning to walk. She was nonverbal, but she had the biggest smile and she gave the biggest hugs ever. We were instantly in love with her and brought her home. As we got to know her, we realized that she had a lot of different kinds of things going on. She really didn't have a behavior problem, but she had a lot of issues. And we had a very good pediatrician, Dr. Ranjini Kandasamy. And, we'd say, what do you think, Dr. Kandasamy? And after a while, she said, there isn't a genetics clinic in Hawaii right now. And I'm not able to diagnose what the problem is, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you to Cedars-Sinai on the mainland to see if we can get a diagnosis. So we went to Cedars-Sinai to get a diagnosis, and she met with doctors, and then they met with us, and the doctor said, well, I have good news and bad news for you. Which would you like first? And I said, well, give me the bad news. And he said, well, the bad news is she has fetal alcohol syndrome. And I'd never heard of it. So I said, well, give me the good news. And now this is 20 years ago. He said, well, the good news is that she has mental retardation, because they used that term back then. And I said, well, why is that good news? And he said, because it will be so apparent to people as she grows that she needs help, that she'll be able to get the kinds of support she needs. I found that to be true, that she has been able to get supports because of that part of the diagnosis. But when we got on the plane to come home, I was so excited because we had that fetal alcohol syndrome diagnosis. And I had experience from the challenges of Jacob's diagnosis, that I just needed to come back, learn as much as I could, identify who the experts were in the field, get to know them, and we would work out plans that would make everything great for Michelle. But when I came home and I started doing research and started talking to lots of folks, I found out that at that time, there was no real expertise in fetal alcohol syndrome in the state of Hawaii. So I decided that I would reach out further and reach out nationally and internationally. So I began correspondence with people that I identified on the internet as experts in fetal alcohol syndrome or fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. And I started writing them. I called them on the telephone. I found out which universities had working groups. And I started inviting myself to, for example, invitation only professional task force meetings and those kinds of things, with the aim of learning more about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, so I could bring that knowledge back to Hawaii and build something that could benefit my daughter, Michelle. Well, after I got to know some of these experts through our correspondence and meeting in person, I would start saying, you know, you really should come for vacation in Hawaii, and I'll show you around when you come. So one by one, they started coming, and then I would say, you know, while you're here on Friday, do you think you could go in and talk to Michelle's teacher, or you think you could meet with her school, or you think you could meet with her mental health social worker? And so for a number of years, there was training that took place on fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, because I would get these experts to come to Hawaii on vacation and rope them into doing these kinds of trainings. Fortunately, today there's task force that are working on educating people about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, but this was 20 years ago. Today, Michelle is 25 years old. Oh, she's going to be 25 next week. And she's very excited about her birthday. She attends Adult Day Health Program at Lanakila, and she loves it. And one of the challenges I have with Michelle now is that she's 25, but her functioning level is about a 6-year-old, and her interests sometimes mostly are like that of a 6-year-old. And so that's kind of a challenge for me. A good example is the other week, her uncle took her to Savers so that she could spend her money to buy old dolls that had long hair, because she likes to brush old dolls, dolly hair, and braid old dolly hair. So she spent all afternoon getting these old dollies so she could brush hair like a 6-year-old. That afternoon, she came home and she was watching, she wanted to watch a video with me, and I'm a big K-pop BTS fan. So we're watching this BTS video, and in it, the BTS members are dancing. And when they're dancing, one of them jumps up and his shirt goes up and exposes his midsection a little bit. And when Michelle sees that, she yells out loud so the neighbors can hear, "Ooh, yeah, hot belly. Let's watch that again, Mom." So do you see my challenge? In some ways, she's 25, and in some ways, she's 6. So I'm still learning how to be a mother of that kind of, a child with that kind of profile. She's such a sweetheart, though. Next slide. A couple of years after Michelle, we got a phone call again from another social worker that we didn't know. And this social worker said, you know, I have a little girl on my caseload. She's 2.5 years old, and she's in a pre-adoptive home, but she's going to be removed. And we want to know if you'd be willing to adopt her. And we said, sure. Well, they called the next day and said, she's being removed today and she's coming over. We'll be over there in 2 hours. Be ready. And Hannah came into our home that day. She was 2.5. She was nonverbal. And as we got to know her, we noticed that there were a lot of kind of odd kinds of things that she would do. She didn't talk for a long time. And she went to school. She was in special education, but still nobody really had a handle on what was up with her. And so when she was 7 years old, the Department of Education sent her to the Behavioral Specialty Clinic at Kapiolani to be seen by Dr. Jeff Okamoto. So, and she was seen for lots of months. And every month I'd go back and I'd say to Dr. Okamoto, so what's the diagnosis? What do you think's wrong with her? And he would say, you know, there's so many things going on. I'm still considering things. Bring her back next month. About this same time period, we got a call from another social worker who said, I'm with Department of Human Services, and I don't know if you knew that Hannah has 2 younger half siblings. And I said, no, I didn't know that. And she said, well, they've come into foster care and we're trying to find a home that will, a foster home for them. Would you consider taking them? And I said, well, you know, we're not in the foster care business, but since there are siblings to Hannah, half siblings to Hannah, we'll be glad to take them. And so we took in an 18-month little girl named Lehua and a 3-year-old girl named Carly. And it was very, very, very challenging, chaotic, complex at our home at this time, because we had all these other kids that had some kinds of needs. And then we had these two that came with their own needs. But they truly, I truly have to say they were a blessing in so many ways. And one of the ways they were a blessing is what they brought. They brought a stack of medical files inches high. And as I looked through every medical report to see what I needed to do to help them, I came across an old psychiatric report. And in this report, the psychiatrist said, quote, "Mom admitted drinking vodka every day while she was pregnant with her first child. And that first child was Hannah." Because of the challenge I had had of learning about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders with Michelle, I knew that that was a valuable piece of information that somehow had been buried. I took that report to Dr. Okamoto at our next visit, and he said, this is what I needed. He said, you know, she fit the profile for a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, specifically alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. But to get the diagnosis, I needed confirmed maternal use. With this report, I have that. And so Hannah was diagnosed with alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. Her two half siblings were eventually adopted by another family we know. And because of Hannah's diagnosis, I was able to share information with them. And both girls were diagnosed with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Hannah is now 21 years old. I exited her from the Department of Education a year early. She attends adult day health at Manavalea in Waipio. She has services through Developmental Disabilities Division, workers who come and help her to gain different skills and to interact in the community. And several nights a week, she goes to a respite home in Eva Beach, which provides respite for her from us and provides respite for us from her. Hannah is very, very complicated. She can be very volatile. And there have been times when we have had to call the police, including this last Mother's Day, because she gets upset and begins attacking people, hurting people, and destroying property. Hannah started having seizures when she was 10 years old, and they were not controlled by medication. This past November, she was diagnosed with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and she wouldn't have gotten that diagnosis if it wasn't for a couple of things that happened. First, as a family, we had noticed that her speech has declined over the last 5 years. She used to speak very clearly, and her speech has become more and more unintelligible. Second, she had a speech therapist at Castle High School who was concerned about her speech, but was more concerned about other things. For example, her balance and the way she walked, her gait, her posture, and finally her handwriting. She used to have very nice penmanship, and now it had deteriorated where you can't read anything that she writes. So in November, she was accepted by the Epilepsy Center at Queens. She was monitored there and received a diagnosis of Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is a rare form of epilepsy that is progressive, and that people with that diagnosis often lose skills. And that's kind of what we're seeing and have been seeing for the last several years. So there certainly are challenges that will help us, hopefully help us learn more about the kinds of things we can do to support Hannah. Next. Well, 8 years ago, we got a call about a young boy who was in a therapeutic foster home, and he was 9 years old. He had been He had been in foster care most of his life. He had been in an adoptive home with an older brother, but he was returned to the state because of his behaviors. He then went into a shelter before they could find a therapeutic foster home for him. And they called us and they said, would you be interested in adopting him? But before you adopt him, you'd have to become a therapeutic foster home so we could see if it could work out. So we said, okay, well, let's meet him. So the picture with my husband is the first day that we met him. He was this little guy, cute as can be, and very, very excited about getting a family. So he came to us and we were his therapeutic foster home before we adopted him. He had a lot of behavior problems, very severe behavior problems and maladaptive behaviors. And a lot of it was very confusing for me, but we had people around who could support us. And then we adopted him 7 years ago. Today, he is 17 years old and he'll graduate in 2 weeks from Hakipu'u Learning Center. He's worked for the last year at Blazing Steaks at Windward Mall, and he works 20 hours a week and enjoys that. And his behavior, he still has some issues, a lot of them just plain teenage issues, but he's come such a long way. He's gotten to discipline himself really well. When he first started working, I talked to him about budgeting and encouraged him to be a saver. I think you'll be hard pressed to find another 17-year-old who has thousands and thousands of dollars in the bank. I'll bet many of you don't have as much money saved as this boy has been able to save. I'm very proud of him. Ryan is my hero. I say it again and again, because can you imagine the challenge of being 9 years old and losing everybody that you've ever known and loved? Moving to a side of the island you've never been to, moving in with people you've never met. And although you've had a dream of a dream family, these people, the parents are old. And the other kids who are home consist of 2 girls who can sometimes act kind of weird. And you're introduced into a culture which you have no experience with. That's what Ryan faced at age 9. And today I am so proud of the young man he is. What's in Ryan's future? I found out several weeks ago that he had talked with the bishop of our congregation and that he's planning to go on a mission for our church in September when he turns 18. Shortly after Ryan came into our family, we started visiting a little boy who was in a long-term care facility in Eva. And he was very medically fragile. And we visited him for 6 months. He had a trach, he was fed by a tube, he was a quadriplegic, and he had brain damage to the extent that he didn't acknowledge most of what was around him. But we went and visited him every week for 6 months, and we really got to learn much more about him and to truly love him. Shortly after Thanksgiving in 2016, we got a call from the facility informing us that his health had taken a turn for the worse and that he was never going to be adoptable and he was never going to be able to leave the facility and that we weren't to visit him anymore. So that was a really heartbreaking thing for us because we had prepared ourselves to welcome one more into our family. 2 months later, next slide, we got a call from another social worker that we didn't know. And she asked us if we might be interested in taking into our home a little 3.5-year-old boy who was at Kapiolani Medical Center, had been there most of his life, and he was medically fragile. And we said, okay, well, we'll come visit him and we'll see how that goes. So we went to visit him and his name was Taylor. When we walked, now, when most people meet Taylor or have met Taylor, they get kind of scared because he is kind of scary. But when we walked in that day, we felt no fear and we weren't intimidated at all. And it's because we had had that challenge and that blessing of getting to know that other medically fragile child for 6 months in that other facility. Taylor was a lot like that other little boy. He had a trach to breathe. He was fed around the clock using a G tube. He was a spastic quadriplegic. He had many, many, many other health conditions. He could barely hear, couldn't see very well, and he also had Down syndrome. But we instantly fell in love with him. And after weeks of learning how to care for him medically, the hospital, the Department of Human Services, everyone decided that we had obtained enough skills, learned enough skills in order to bring him home. And so we did. And our goal became to make his world bigger, to help him see what the world was like and to help him thrive outside of an institution. We were able to do that again because we had had that experience with that other boy. I think if you were to ask any of our family members, our immediate family or our extended family, I think all of them would say that, excuse me, I might get a little emotional, that taking Taylor into our family was one of the greatest blessings we've ever had because he changed us. Every single one of us, he changed. As we've accepted and opened our arms and our hearts and our homes to these children who needed a place, we've only been able to do that because of other people who have made room for them. And so next slide, I'd like to just introduce you to some of those people today. The first little girl up in the corner is named Mila. And when Taylor was in kindergarten, I got a letter in his backpack, and this letter said, "Hi, my name is Jessica. My daughter Mila is in Taylor's class and she just loves him. And she's been begging me to see if they could get together for a play date. So I'm wondering if maybe he could come by sometime and they could swim in the pool and I'd watch them and they'd have a good time. Let me know." And she left her number. And I called her and I said, "Has Mila told you anything about Taylor?" And she said, "No." And so I began to describe Taylor's condition to her. And she said, "Well, I guess the pool's out then, but maybe we could have our play date at the mall." And so that picture is of Mila and Taylor's first play date at the mall. We wouldn't have had as wonderful a time accepting Taylor and bringing Taylor into our family and into our hearts if it wasn't for people like Mila and her family, her parents that raised her to open her social circle to include kids like Taylor. The picture below that of Michelle is with a young man named Kaliko Adams. And we knew Kaliko his whole life. He and Michelle are about the same age. I knew Kaliko's parents, his grandparents. We all attended the same church. Kaliko went to St. Louis. Michelle went to Castle, but they still would see each other at church. High school, you have proms. Our church would have a prom as well. And one day when I went to church, Kaliko came up to me and said, "Hey, sis, do you mind if I ask Michelle to the church prom?" And I said, "Oh, no, that would be fine." And so just like any other teenager, Michelle got asked to a prom by Kaliko. And he bought her the little wristlet flower thing, and they went and they had a wonderful time. Now, she knew Kaliko was just her friend, not her boyfriend, but she was so thrilled that she would be able to participate in a regular teenage thing. And I'm so grateful to the Adams family that raised a son like Kaliko, who opened his world to include my daughter. The gentleman up top in the middle is my cousin Herman, and he's really famous because he, among his many talents, he's an expert at Hawaiian feather work, feather lay. He's been all over the world teaching feather work. And he's also very famous because he dances hula all over in Waikiki. And on social media, he has huge crowds that follow him from venue to venue to see him dance hula. Herman is very special because he embraced our son, Ryan. And because of Herman, Ryan became interested in feather work, lei hulu, and for his senior project chose feather work. And Herman not only taught him about that art, but in doing so, taught him about the culture. And in doing that, taught him about the family. This boy who came and had no attachment to family now feels a very deep attachment to family, especially Herman, because Herman made room for him in his life. The next three people that are up there all have worked for the Department of Education, and those who know me know that I've had kind of a, sometimes contentious relationship with the Department of Education. I think that a lot of parents of kids with disabilities, we go into the Department of Education and we're advocating for what we feel is in the best interest of our child. But a lot of times we encounter people in the department who we feel, in our opinion, are acting in the best interest of the department. So sometimes it can be very, very contentious. These three people, however, prove that there's a lot of goodness there. The woman at the bottom in the middle, Abby Royston, is a district psychologist for Windward District, and she worked with every single one of my children. And what she did, and we always didn't get along, we didn't always agree, we were often at opposite sides of the table, but what I saw was an individual that once she learned what the need was, once she recognized what the strengths were, and once she understood what the disability was, she worked as hard as she can to see that other people who worked with my children made room for them. The next lady at the top, Bev Reedy, was a district educational specialist for Windward District. And I had learned because of my challenges with autism that not only do you need to know who the frontline worker is, you need to know who the person is who has the ability to commit resources. And Bev Reedy was that person. I first met her through due process. So we were actually on opposite ends right there. But I found her to be, with every single one of my children, an individual who, once she recognized what the need was, went above and beyond to make sure that classroom, that school, that principal made room for these kids that in some instances were so different than anybody else they'd ever met. The lady at the bottom, Gina Tingstrom. You know, Gina taught several of my children. And when she taught my daughter, Hannah, she and I had a problem between us, and it got huge. And it got to the point where I was like, I never want to see this woman again. My daughter is getting out of her class. I never want to speak with her. I am so over this woman. I didn't go around telling people, saying bad things about her, but in my heart, I was like, I will never acknowledge her. If I see her in public, I will never acknowledge her. I'm done with her. And for 10 years, I held that kind of resentment and animosity for this woman. Then along came Taylor, and they said, and the principal said, Taylor's going to be in Gina's class. And I said, oh no, that's not happening. And the principal said, oh yeah, it's happening. And so I was faced with a challenge of reconciling my feelings and reconciling how I could coexist with this person that I felt a great deal of resentment for and animosity towards. To her credit, Gina didn't pay attention to the way I was feeling about her, but she focused on my little boy, and she made room for him in her classroom. And she made sure that the school knew him and knew what his needs were. She was his most ardent advocate within the Department of Education. And I saw that the love that she had for him and the talent she had, because she also made room for him in her heart. And now I'm so happy that Gina, I was finally able to get rid of all of that very, very unwarranted feelings. And I love this woman. She is one of my dearest and closest friends. And I'm so happy that she found room in her heart and in her home, not just for Taylor, but for me as well. Next slide. And this is my last slide. Finally, I think that our challenge of taking these children in and loving these children was made easier because of a special group of women. And these women are, I call them warrior mamas. And we all met because most of us, Dr. Greg Yim was our neurologist, and he had a meeting once for parents, and we all kind of hooked up there. All of these moms in this circle are moms of children that are on the very severe end of disabilities. And this picture was taken about 3 years ago at the celebration of life for a little boy named Micah, and his mom, Lisa, is the one in the red. And it was very emotional. That hug we had that day was so emotional because each of us loved Lisa so much. And at the same time as we hugged her, I know what each of us was thinking. It was, this could be me. And so we went to great lengths to make room for Lisa and her family since that day, to make room for them and their grief. 6 months ago, I became Lisa when our little boy Taylor passed away after a sudden illness. And these mamas made room for me again, not just room in their arms, but room in their very, very busy lives. They continue to make room for me and for my family and for our grief. And I'm so grateful for that. You know, my presentation was called Always Room for One More. I know that taking in a child with disabilities is not for everyone, but making room for one more is something that everybody can do. Maybe it's making room for them at your lunchroom table or at the cafeteria table. Maybe it's making room for someone who is different on the playground or in a class you take, or maybe it's making room for them in your practice or around your dinner table or your holiday celebrations. But maybe, just maybe, it is making room for them in your home and in your family. Not a month goes by where I don't get a call from a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, an agency asking if I know somebody, if I know a family who might be interested in taking a kid with disabilities. It might not be you, but it might be somebody you know. So I think that's my main message to you, that there are kids that need families, and there's always room for one more. Maybe it's you, maybe it's someone you know. And that's what I wanted to share today. I'm open for any questions.
Wow, mahalo nui for sharing. I can feel it in my heart, your story. I've got tissue. So yes, we are open for questions. I do have a question. I feel like you have this superpower. And it's also probably because I don't have a lot of exposure to children's or family with disabilities. And so where do you get your superpower from? And then how do you self-care, I guess?
Well, I think I'm an ordinary person, and I think my husband is an ordinary person, but I think what we've had is extraordinary opportunities and extraordinary support from so many people. And I don't think I'm that special. Self-care, as soon as we get off this, I'm flying to the Big Island, and my brother is flying in from California, and we're going to have a nice reunion tonight. And that's the kind of thing I like to do for self-care.
Very nice. I had another question, but now I can't remember what I was. Oh, so for those of us that unintentionally don't think about, so I went to DC recently for a trip, right? And I was with someone who had a stroller, and we had to ride the metro, right? And so, it dawned on me, we had to go to, not all elevators were available at every stop, right? So it made me think, how do we be more sensitive, more aware, and less ableist, right? And what can we do to help?
Well, I think that little trip that you took, that made you more aware. And I think as we associate and include in our circles, our social circles, our professional circles, people that are different, then we do become more aware. I used to travel a great deal. And wherever I went, that's one of the things I would look for. I'd say, oh, this place would be terrible for people with wheelchairs, or and when somebody would say, well, do you have any questions about this? It would usually be about how someone with a disability would handle something in that country. I think the more you're around it and expose yourself to it, the more aware you become and the more sensitive you are to those kinds of needs.
That makes sense. Mahalo. You're getting lots of love in the chat. I see there, Ginny. Very moving, very touching. But let's see, we have another question. Ginny, you are exceptional. Mindset is important. How would you describe your mindset in those you've worked with that you've had more successes with?
I'm really kind of an optimistic person, and I always have been. And I've always been to the mindset that, like when I went away to college in Utah, I said to myself, this can be a good move or a bad move. I'm going to make it a good move. And I really believe that people have the power to make changes. They just have to believe and not give up. And I think that's the kind of mindset that you need to have and instill in your children, whether they have disabilities or not.
All right. Mahalo. Any other questions, comments, or feedback for Ginny? We do have, so just to let you know, the recording will be available to everyone that registered, even those that didn't attend with us online. Our goal is to get it out 7 to 10 days. We are in training for support, so it might take a little bit longer to get that recording, but we will email it to you along with, I don't know if Ginny, you're okay with sending the pictures and the slides with that?
Sure, that's fine. I'm fine.
Okay, perfect. I just think that I really like how you took initiative and invited yourself. To me, that's just a mom trying to be a good mom. I just find that really inspirational to not give up. And I think I learned a lot about being a mother and being able to advocate for your children. And it's just really amazing. I can't even mahalo you enough for being here today, taking the time. When I invited you, I didn't hear from you for a couple of days, so I was kind of worried, but I'm really, really grateful that we were able to connect and that you spent the time with us today. And I really mahalo those that joined us too as well. So just to let you know, the next webinar we have coming up is, so they're the second and fourth Fridays of the month. And this one that's coming up is actually a part 2 of Native Americans in Hawaii, featuring Meali'i Prieto and Ireneo Villaren. And you'll be getting an announcement for that. But in the meantime, everybody, malama kekahi and ahuiho, will keep in touch. And mahalo kamawela for the back-end tech support. So everybody, aloha.
Bye-bye.